never imagined the day I'd walk into my own home and be told I didn't exist. My name is Elena, and I have worked hard for every single brick of the townhouse I own on Oak Street. It was supposed to be a routine check-in with my tenant, a man named Julian who had always seemed perfectly normal, if a bit quiet. But as I walked up the driveway, I noticed something was off. The garden was overgrown, and the familiar welcome mat was gone. When I reached for the handle, my key wouldn't even fit into the lock. I knocked firmly, expecting a simple explanation about a broken tumbler or a security upgrade. Instead, the door opened only a few inches, held by a heavy security chain. Julian looked out at me, but his eyes weren't filled with the usual polite recognition. They were cold, distant, and disturbingly calm. Before I could even say hello or ask why my key didn't work, he spoke in a voice that sounded like ice cracking. He told me that I needed to leave the premises immediately. He claimed the house no longer belonged to me. In fact, he looked me right in the eye and said the property now belonged to the estate of a deceased owner. I stood on the porch, my mouth hanging open in pure shock. I thought it was a sick joke at first, a truly twisted attempt at humor. I laughed nervously, waiting for him to break character and tell me he was just frustrated with a plumbing issue. But Julian didn't smile. Instead, he reached into a folder he was carrying and pulled out a piece of paper. He held it up against the glass of the storm door so I could see it clearly. My heart stopped. It was a death certificate. It had the official seal, the correct fonts, and my full name, Elena Vance, printed right at the top. According to that piece of paper, I had passed away 3 months ago in a car accident across the state. The document looked terrifyingly real at a glance. I felt my entire body go still because, in that one sentence and that one forged paper, he had tried to erase me completely. He was using a lie to steal my home and turn my entire life into nothing more than confusing paperwork. The worst part was the smug look on his face, a look of total triumph, as if he knew I was already beaten. My heart raced as I backed away from the door, my mind spinning in 1,000 directions. I retreated to my car, locking the doors as if the physical barrier could protect me from the madness I had just witnessed. I pieced together how someone I had trusted enough to rent my property could go this far. I had been a good landlord. I had fixed the heater in the winter and lowered the rent when he said he was struggling. The thought of losing everything I had worked for sent chills down my spine. This wasn't just a disagreement about a security deposit. This was a calculated attempt to steal my legacy. I looked back at the house, my house, and saw the curtain twitch. Julian was watching me. He wasn't scared that I was alive. He was waiting for me to disappear. I realized then that I wasn't just dealing with a dishonest person. I was dealing with a predator who had spent months planning my death, while I was busy living my life. This was a calculated theft, a deep betrayal that made the air in my car feel thin and cold. I knew I couldn't just call a locksmith. This was much bigger. As I sat there, the tension escalated inside me. I wanted to scream, to kick the door down, and to demand my life back. But a small, rational voice in my head told me to be careful. Every move I made now felt like walking on a knife's edge. I took a deep breath and started my car, pulling away slowly. I needed to see if the lie had spread. I went to the local records office, my hands shaking so hard I could barely hold the steering wheel. As I dug through the recent filings, I realized the nightmare was even worse than I thought. Julian hadn't just made a fake paper. He had built a whole story around my passing. He had filed affidavits and small claims as a representative of the estate. It was a calculated attempt to move the property into his control before anyone noticed I was still breathing. This wasn't a moment of panic on his part. It was a long-term strategy. He had studied the system and found the cracks. I realized that if I didn't act perfectly, the law might actually believe the dead woman over the living one. The suspense kept me on edge as I wondered if I'd actually get justice. I drove to the police station, but the officer at the desk looked at me with confusion. When I explained that my tenant claimed I was dead, he chuckled, then saw my expression and stopped. He told me it sounded like a civil matter, and that I should talk to a lawyer. The frustration burned in my chest. I felt like a ghost walking through my own town. I called my sister Clara and my best friend Simon. They both warned me to tread carefully. They were terrified for me. They said that if Julian was bold enough to forge a government document, he might be capable of much worse. They reminded me that this wasn't just about property anymore. It was about betrayal, deception, and a serious crime. They begged me to stay at a hotel and let the professionals handle it. But the thought of Julian sleeping in my bed, using my kitchen, and slowly erasing my existence made me sick. I couldn't just wait for a court date months away. I needed to find out how deep this went. I needed to know if I was the only one he was doing this to. I decided right then that I was going into full investigation mode. The first physical sign that things had gone too far was when I returned to the house later that evening, hoping to catch him off guard. I didn't even try the door this time. I looked at the hardware. It was brand new. He had replaced the deadbolt with a high-tech smart lock. My old access was completely gone. I had become a stranger to my own address overnight. Standing there in the silence of the twilight, I could feel the humiliation burning hotter than the anger. He had not only forged a death certificate, he had acted on it with terrifying speed. This meant he was moving fast for a reason. He wanted to create a new reality, where he was the rightful occupant before I could mount a defense. I took out my phone and started taking photos of the new locks, the overgrown grass, and the darkened windows. I needed a trail of evidence that showed the transition. I recorded the time and date of every observation. I was no longer a victim. I was a hunter. I was going to find the loophole he used and close it on him. The next morning I started asking questions around the neighborhood. I learned the lie had already traveled much farther than I ever expected. My neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Higgins, almost dropped her watering can when she saw me. She told me Julian had told everyone I passed away in a tragic accident while traveling. He had even suggested that a small memorial service had already been held privately by my distant relatives. My stomach dropped at the thought that people I had known for years actually believed I was gone. Utility records were already being changed into his name. Mail was being redirected to a P.O. box I didn't own. There were whispers throughout the block that the owner had passed away and the tenant was handling the property transition out of the goodness of his heart. If he had already convinced the neighbors and the utility companies, I realized that undoing this would be a mountain of work. He was effectively colonizing my life, one bill and one conversation at a time. The more I learned, the more I realized I had to stop being polite. I had to become a problem he couldn't solve. I stopped arguing with people who didn't believe me and started gathering every piece of paper I could find. I went to my storage unit and pulled out original tax documents, the house deed, utility bills from 3 years ago, and every lease agreement Julian had ever signed. I created a massive folder of my existence. The more I collected, the clearer the pattern became. This tenant hadn't just improvised a lie. He had built a physical trail around it. He had been planning this for at least 6 months. I found small discrepancies in my bank statements where he had tried to divert small amounts of money or change contact information. I kept thinking, if he was bold enough to do this to me, what else had he already touched? Was he doing this to other properties? I felt a cold realization that I wasn't just fighting for a house. I was fighting a professional. This was his job. He was a fraudster who used the death of landlords as a business model. I felt a rush of outrage that gave me a strange, sharp clarity. I was going to break his streak. I decided to confront Julian directly one more time, but this time I wasn't going to be the confused victim. I waited for him to come out to get the mail. When he saw me standing by his car, the tension in the air was immediate. He didn't look scared, he looked annoyed. He insisted again that the papers were legitimate and that I was harassing him. But I noticed that every time I asked a simple, direct question, like which hospital issued the certificate, his voice kept slipping. He would stumble over a word or glance away toward the house. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a loud spectacle in the street. I just kept watching him, my eyes fixed on his, watching him slowly unravel under the weight of his own lie. I told him I knew the certificate was a fake and that I had already contacted the authorities. For a split second his mask slipped. He looked frantic. And then he said something that made me realize I was only hearing the very surface of the story. During our tense exchange, Julian tried to defend himself by saying that I shouldn't be angry with him. He accidentally admitted that the document had come from someone who knew what they were doing. He implied that he was just following a process that had been set up for him. That was all I needed to hear. A fake death certificate doesn't just appear out of nowhere. It requires access to specific software or a contact inside a government office. Suddenly, the situation felt much bigger than one dishonest tenant. I replayed the conversation in my head and realized why he had been so nervous when I pushed for details. He wasn't the mastermind. He was the front man. Someone else had helped him or someone else had taught him exactly how far to push this scheme. This was an organized effort to steal high-value assets by exploiting the slow-moving nature of probate and estate law. I wasn't just dealing with a thief. I was dealing with a syndicate. The realization made my blood run cold, but it also made me more determined to win. I knew I needed proof of his admissions, so I went back a few days later with my phone ready. I had downloaded a high-quality recording app. This time I didn't lead with accusations. I acted like I was ready to negotiate. I let him talk longer than usual. The more he spoke, the more he exposed his own lies. He kept trying to sound confident and authoritative, but the confidence was paper-thin. I could hear the underlying panic in his tone, like he was trying to hold a heavy door shut that was already cracking open under pressure. He started talking about ownership changing hands, and how the process was already too far gone for me to stop it. He even hinted that if I just walked away, there might be a settlement for me. Hearing him talk about my own life as a commodity to be traded made my blood run cold. I stayed silent, letting the recording catch every stutter and every arrogant claim. I had him. I just needed to make sure the evidence was enough to convince a judge who had seen it all. I spent the next 48 hours diving into property records and related filings at the county building. What I found was ugly. I saw signs that someone had been trying to create a new reality around my home for months. There were small changes to the deed's digital footprint. There were strange delays in my property tax notifications that I had previously attributed to mail errors. There were several official-looking steps that had been taken to make the fraud seem less obvious to a casual observer. It was a brilliant slow-motion crime that depended entirely on nobody looking too closely at the details. Julian and his associates were betting on my laziness or my confusion. They expected me to be so overwhelmed by the official nature of the paperwork that I would simply give up. That meant the longer I waited to strike back, the more dangerous and legal their lie would become. I realized I couldn't wait for the system to wake up. I had to shake the system until it had no choice but to look at me. My family was terrified. Clara and Simon called me every hour, begging me to back off. They were scared that Julian or his friends would turn violent if they felt cornered. They told me not to push too hard against someone who was already lying this boldly. They suggested I just hire a massive law firm and stay in another city until it was over. But backing off felt impossible to me. If I stepped away now, I'd be leaving my own home in the hands of a man who had already declared me dead on paper. I couldn't live with the idea of him winning by default. The part that terrified me most wasn't the threat of violence. It was the fact that they still seemed so confident that I wouldn't fight back. They viewed me as a nuisance, not a threat. They thought I was a confused woman who didn't understand how the world worked. That was their biggest mistake. I was going to use their own arrogance against them. I was going to become the nightmare they tried to invent for me. As the pressure from my side started rising, Julian changed his tactics. He stopped being cold and started acting like I was the unstable one. When I showed up to document the property, he called the police and told them a disturbed woman was claiming to be the deceased owner. He told the neighbors I was a distant relative who was confused by grief and should just let the estate process continue. It was a neat, cruel trick. Steal everything a person owns, and then paint the real owner as the one with a mental problem. It made me doubt my own sanity for a split second, which was exactly what he wanted. But I could feel how desperate he was becoming. A person only attacks your credibility and sanity when they know the objective truth is closing in on them. He was trying to gaslight the entire community so that nobody would listen to my evidence. But gaslighting only works if you stay quiet. I was done being quiet. I was going to be the loudest person in his life. I finally found the missing piece of the puzzle. I had been scouring the death certificate under a magnifying glass for days. I found a tiny, almost invisible watermark that didn't match the official state paper. I traced the digital signature on one of the electronic filings Julian had made. It led back to a name I didn't recognize, a contact in a different county, and a pathway for how the forgery had moved through the system. It wasn't enough to prove the whole crime yet, but it was a solid lead. It showed that this was much bigger than one fake page created in a basement. Someone with professional knowledge had helped this lie get traction. I sat in my car, staring at the name on my screen, realizing I was no longer just chasing one dishonest tenant. I was chasing a network of fraudsters who specialized in stealing the dead. The scale of it was staggering, but having a name gave me power. I felt like I finally had the thread that would unravel the entire sweater. Instead of confronting Julian again immediately with my new discovery, I decided to go quiet. I stopped calling him. I stopped showing up at the house. I let him think that his gaslighting had worked and that I was backing off. My silence made him sloppy. He got comfortable. I watched from a distance as he started moving more of his own things into the house. He even had a contractor come by to look at the kitchen. Comfortable people reveal much more than frightened ones. Meanwhile, I was building my case piece by piece in the background. I was working with a private investigator to link the name I found to other estates Julian had been involved with. I was waiting for the perfect moment when he'd say or do just enough to expose himself completely. I didn't know it yet, but he was about to make a very expensive mistake. He thought he had won the war of attrition. He didn't realize I was just repositioning my heavy artillery. The pressure suddenly intensified when I learned that Julian was trying to rush the transfer of the deed. He had filed for an emergency sale of the property, claiming the estate needed liquidity to pay off imaginary debts. This meant he was no longer just pretending to live there. He was trying to make the fraud permanent and irreversible by selling the house to a third party. Once the house was sold to an innocent buyer, getting it back would be a legal nightmare that could take years. I felt a rush of outrage so sharp it was almost clear-headed. This was the tipping point. I understood that I couldn't win by arguing or waiting for the slow wheels of the law to turn anymore. I needed to arrive in person and stop the story before it was sealed in a vault of new contracts. I gathered all my original documents, my recordings, and the evidence of the forgery network. It was time for the final confrontation. I went to my house unannounced on a Tuesday morning. I didn't call. I didn't send a lawyer. I just walked up to the door and knocked. When the door opened, the look on Julian's face was pure, unadulterated shock. He had not expected me to be standing there, looking calm and professional, holding a thick folder like a weapon. For one long second, neither of us moved. The air between us was heavy with the weight of the lie he had been living. Then I saw the panic flicker behind his eyes. He knew exactly why I was there. He tried to start his usual routine of confusion and concern, but I just held up my phone. I didn't say a word. I let the silence stretch until it was unbearable. He knew I had something he couldn't talk his way out of this time. The game of pretend was over. I was the owner, I was alive, and I was standing on my own doorstep. Julian tried to act innocent at first, using the same nonsense he had used before. He talked about paperwork errors, and how he was just as much a victim of the estate office as I was. But I wasn't listening. I had his earlier words, his contradictions, and the secret recording in my pocket. The more he tried to talk, the worse he sounded. I didn't interrupt him. I let the silence do most of the work. I have learned that people who are truly innocent usually sound offended and angry. People who are guilty just sound busy. Busy making up new details, busy explaining away the old ones. Julian sounded frantic. He was sweating, his eyes darting around the hallway as if looking for an escape route that wasn't there. I realized that his entire power over me had been based on my own fear. Now that I wasn't afraid, he had nothing. He was just a small man standing in a stolen hallway. Then I played the recording. I hit the button on my phone and let his own voice fill the porch. I played the part where he talked about ownership changing hands, and how he knew the certificate came from a professional. The room changed instantly. His face tightened, and the blood seemed to drain from his skin. The fake confidence disappeared, and all the polished excuses he'd been using for weeks began to collapse like a house of cards. That was the moment he finally understood that I wasn't just guessing anymore. I had heard enough to make him truly afraid of prison, not just a lawsuit. I watched him decide in real time whether to keep lying or start bargaining for his freedom. The silence after the recording ended was the loudest thing I had ever heard. I told him he had 10 minutes to tell me the truth before I called the detectives I had been speaking with. Once he was cornered, the bigger scheme started showing its cracks. Julian began dropping hints about how the forged certificate had been used to delay any resistance from the bank and create space for the title transfer. He admitted that there were others involved who specialized in finding vacant or vulnerable properties where the owners were out of town or lived alone. Suddenly the fraud looked much larger, messier, and more deliberate than I had first imagined. My anger shifted into something colder and more calculated. I realized that I was just one of many targets. If they had tried this with me, a woman with a local family and a clear paper trail, how many other people had they counted on not fighting back? How many elderly people or out-of-state owners had actually lost their homes to these paper ghosts? The cruelty of it was breathtaking. I wasn't just saving my house anymore. I was exposing a factory of theft. I learned what they were really after. This had never been about a tenant trying to stay a few extra months without paying rent. It was about total control, access to my equity, and the eventual sale of the property for a massive profit. My death was the master key they used to unlock every door in the legal and financial system. Every delay I had experienced, every lost letter, and every busy clerk had been a calculated part of their strategy. They weren't waiting for the paperwork to catch up. They were actively trying to outrun my ability to prove I was alive. They wanted to finalize the sale and vanish with the money before I could get a court date. But they hadn't planned on me showing up at the door, unannounced and armed with the truth. Now I was finally standing directly in their path, and there was no way around me. The conversation turned dangerous as Julian realized I wasn't going to accept a bribe or walk away. His tone shifted from frantic excuses to sharp, defensive threats. He stepped closer, trying to use his height to intimidate me, his voice becoming low and ugly. I kept my distance and kept my voice steady, even though my heart was hammering against my ribs. I could feel how much he wanted the situation to unravel on his own terms, perhaps by starting a physical fight so he could claim I was the aggressor. That was the real danger. When liars lose control of the narrative, they often make reckless, violent choices. I had no intention of finding out exactly how far he was willing to go to protect his lie. I stepped back onto the porch, into the light of the morning sun, and told him that the police were already on their way with the evidence I had provided. The threat of the law was the only thing that made him stop moving toward me. I took everything I had gathered, the forged document, the recordings, the timeline, and the property records, and put it directly into the hands of the people who could move the situation forward. I didn't go back to the desk sergeant. I went to the district attorney's office. Every piece of evidence was arranged so that the lie would be impossible to miss, even for the most overworked official. I wasn't asking them to believe my story anymore. I was showing them a fraud so clear it could not survive the light of day. Once the proof started circulating through the right departments, The tenant's version of events began falling apart in real time. The death certificate no longer looked like a clever legal tool. It looked like a criminal exhibit. Every change they had made and every step they had rushed became another piece of evidence against them. I could finally feel the momentum turning, and with it came a sense of control I hadn't felt in months. In the end, the whole scheme collapsed because I refused to disappear. They forged my death certificate to claim my property, but they drastically underestimated the one thing they couldn't fake: my determination to exist. I showed up at their door, I brought the receipts, and I made them face the reality of what they had done. The relief I felt when the locks were finally changed back to my own codes wasn't clean or happy. It was exhausted and fierce. I had not only protected my home, I had forced a dark truth into the open, and that made all the difference. They tried to bury me on paper, but instead I buried their lie in a mountain of evidence. As I sat on my porch, watching the sun set over a house that was officially mine again, I knew I would never take my own existence for granted. I was Elena Vance, I was alive, and I was home.